Okay, let's get going. Welcome. My name's Tiff Macklem. I'm the Dean of the Rotman School of Management. But much more importantly, I'm the chair of Ontario's panel on economic growth and prosperity. And I'm here with Jamison Steeve. Jamison is the executive director of the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity. Jamison usually describes himself as a recovering lawyer. He's a former policy wonk at the highest level at Queen's Park, and we're very fortunate to have him as the executive director of the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity. I have to say, since Jamison arrived, the pace and the impact of the work of the Institute has really picked up. Work on healthcare, a very topical issue, infrastructure, how do we scale up our businesses more rapidly, the effectiveness of government grants in attracting business to Ontario, and one of Jamison's personal passions, how do we get more innovation in government. So Jamison and I are going to be a tag team this morning, and as chair of Ontario's panel on economic growth and prosperity, I get to think big thoughts and then hand off the hard research work to Jamison and his team of researchers. And I'm very pleased, actually, a few of my fellow panel members are here this morning who have been thinking these big thoughts and handing off with me, Sam Duboc, Marcia Moffat, and Tim Penner. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to launch us, and then I'm going to hand off to Jamison to really take us through most of the meat. So clusters. Why clusters? Well, in Ontario, in Canada, we often bemoan our lack of innovation, our lagging productivity performance. If you look at StatsCan's measures of productivity, things like total factor productivity, they seem kind of detached from the lives of people in Ontario. Even as a business person, I mean, total factor productivity, does that really matter? Is it really measured right? It's pretty arcane stuff. At the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, we have tried to provide a measure that is actually meaningful for Ontario citizens. Productivity growth, as I think you all know, is really the only sustainable source of increases in our standard of living. And when the Institute of Competitiveness and Prosperity compares productivity growth in Ontario compared to other areas, other provinces, other states in the United States that have a similar industrial structure, so in other words, legitimate comparators, the cost of lagging productivity growth is $12,500 per Ontario citizens. My family, we're 5 of us, multiply that by 5, $62,500 as a household. That's real money. It really matters. Government policy has certainly been well aware of this, and there has been sustained efforts over the last few decades to create jobs, improve prosperity. And you could roughly lump these into 2 strategies. One is get the fundamentals right. Low stable inflation, prudent fiscal policy, low corporate taxes, accelerated depreciation, trade agreements to get us access to foreign markets. And actually, if you look at Canada, there's always things we could do better, but we've actually done reasonably well on these framework policies. And I think that's been very beneficial. Problem is productivity growth has slowed through much of this period. At the other end of the spectrum, you basically have governments buying jobs, bidding for business. Governments provide corporate subsidies, large grants to big businesses in return for jobs. The problem with this is that there's 2 problems. One is it's become a race for the bottom. We can't, in Ontario, we can't compete with some of the subsidies being offered by some of the U.S. states. So if it's a pure bidding war, we're going to lose. And the other reality is it hasn't proved that effective. The jobs are pretty expensive to create, and there's no guarantee they stay. The idea is that you create these jobs, it creates incomes that builds prosperity. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it has not. You can think of cluster policy somewhere in the middle. It's more directed than just lowering corporate taxes for the whole country and hoping that'll be a source of business growth, but it's less directed than providing direct grants to specific companies. So In the early 2000s, 2002, 3, 4, the Institute, under the leadership of Roger Martin, actually did some very good work on clusters. In many respects, this work was ahead of its time, and now more than 10 years later, at least those of us on the panel, I thought it was a good time to come back to this topic. The other thing we're doing this morning is we're going to do something that's a little unusual for the Institute. The Institute, we're very good at pointing out all the things that we do badly, where we've gone wrong, and where we need to improve. So we thought we'd try something a little more uplifting this morning. We thought we'd look at what are we actually doing well? What's working? And then how could we do more of what's working? How could we extend what's working to other areas? And we actually have some very strong clusters in Ontario. Toronto is a world-leading financial center. We have a very successful automotive cluster in Windsor, Oshawa, Guelph, Waterloo, Cambridge area. We have a very successful information technology and information communications technology cluster in Waterloo and Toronto. What are the key elements of those clusters that gets them to work? How could we get them working better, and what lessons can we take from what's working? So what I'm going to do with that introduction is just provide you a brief definition of clusters and talk about some of the benefits of the clusters. Then I'm going to turn it over to Jamison, who's going to talk about 5 strong clusters in Ontario, identify some of the barriers to making these clusters even stronger, and then conclude with some recommendations. So